2 weeks had passed since the Battle of the Trident ended in Robert Baratheon's crushing victory over the royalist forces sworn to the Targaryen name. The smell of churned mud and blood still lingered in the memory of any man who had fought that day, clinging to their garments, haunting them in their dreams. The aftermath was no less tumultuous than the war itself. In a world of broken vows and broken crowns, alliances had to be forged in haste, often tinged with bitterness. Yet it was also a time ripe with possibility. Robert Baratheon had seized the Iron Throne, and a new age beckoned. The Targaryen dynasty was shattered, its remnants fleeing across the sea or hiding in whatever shadows they could find on Westeros. Now, in the realm's uneasy quiet, everyone waited to see how Robert Baratheon would mold his reign, with the loyalty of the Seven Kingdoms in delicate balance. Eddard Stark had departed from the aftermath of the Trident with a weariness that clung to him like a second skin. The victory had been overshadowed by the worry for his sister, Lyanna Stark, whose disappearance had fueled the war in the first place. Yet the war had also led Ned to a new and unexpected fate. In the flurry of negotiations that followed Robert's coronation, Tywin Lannister had stepped forward, offering an alliance through the betrothal of his daughter, Cersei, to Eddard Stark. It was a proposition that caught Ned by surprise and left him haunted by more responsibilities than he ever could have anticipated. Ned, a man who abhorred politics, suddenly found himself as a central figure in a new web of obligations, expectations, and potential betrayals. Lyanna Stark lived. Her body had been weak when Ned found her, but she had not succumbed to the final blow that, in another fate, might have taken her life. Instead, she was spirited away to a safe location immediately after Rhaegar Targaryen's defeat. Rhaegar himself now lying dead on the Trident's banks, his famed rubies scattered in the current. Robert Baratheon, whose fury had ignited the rebellion, had yearned for Lyanna with a single-minded passion. His dream was not destroyed by her death. Instead, it was revived by her survival. With the war's end, Robert insisted upon taking Lyanna to the Red Keep, protecting her with all the might and pomp he could muster. The days that followed were a whirlwind of ceremonies. Tywin Lannister yielding the city gates of King's Landing just in time to prevent further bloodshed, while the rebels consolidated power. In short order, Robert declared his intent to marry Lyanna Stark. Within those 2 weeks, the bride whom many believed had been lost became the new symbol of the realm's future. That left Ned in an odd predicament. He was no longer Robert's prospective brother-in-law. He was now the brother of the Queen-to-be, subservient in some measure to Robert's power and feeling the weight of familial debts that came with such a station. He had also returned from the south bearing a child, Jon, whose parentage he refused to discuss openly with anyone. Many assumed it was just another war bastard sired on the campaign, a rarity for Ned Stark's stoic reputation, but not unthinkable in the chaos of war. None but Ned knew the truth of this boy's birth, and none would glean it from him, for Ned's honor demanded his silence. As far as Westeros was concerned, the dark-haired child in Ned's arms was the Stark's bastard, and that scandal alone was enough to spread gossip through the courts and keeps, from the north to the Riverlands and beyond. Ned's secret weighed heavily on his heart, but hardly heavier than the new arrangement that had been forced upon him. A marriage to Cersei Lannister. Robert's advisors, as well as Robert himself, had pointed out the necessity of forging a tight bond with House Lannister. Tywin Lannister had been observing from the sidelines for much of the conflict, but his late intervention at King's Landing had helped clinch the rebellion's success. Outwardly, Tywin declared that the realm had to unite under the new king's banner, and that House Lannister would show its loyalty by joining its house to that of the new monarchy's supporters. With Robert determined to marry Lyanna, the idea of Cersei Lannister marrying Ned Stark was as practical as it was precarious. Ned recognized the game Robert was playing, to keep Tywin close, to ensure that the gold of Casterly Rock poured into the royal treasury, and to quell any potential insurrection. Yet Ned felt uneasy. He could not shake the instinctual dread that the Lannisters might present a threat to the new order. Still, for the sake of the realm, and perhaps for the sake of his sister's future as well, Ned had bowed his head and agreed. The betrothal had been hurried, and the wedding day was fast approaching. King's Landing was in a feverish state as the city prepared to seat Robert Baratheon on the Iron Throne and see him wed to Lyanna Stark, all while celebrating the union of Lord Eddard Stark and Cersei Lannister. The streets, still littered with the debris of sack and riot, were being hastily cleared. Bodies of the unclaimed had already been burned or buried. The Red Keep itself had thrown its gates wide to welcome the new royal household and the lords who had supported the rebellion. Cersei Lannister arrived in state, with her father Tywin and her brother Jaime at her side, her face composed behind a mask of regal solemnity. She had no illusions about what this marriage truly was. A political alliance, forged in the uncertain times after war. Yet behind her poise, behind her pale green eyes, she nursed her own ambitions and fears. Eddard Stark saw her for the first time in the Great Hall of the Red Keep, where Robert had set up temporary arrangements while the deeper parts of the castle were being prepared for the coronation ceremonies. Ned had come to the capital directly from the Trident, dusty and battle-worn, with only a few changes of clothing to remind him of Winterfell. He stood stiffly in a fresh tunic, bearing the direwolf sigil. Across the hall, near one of the tall arched windows, Cersei was draped in luxurious green and gold, her golden hair falling in thick waves over her shoulders. She was not smiling. It seemed no one in that hall had much reason to. Robert was absent from this initial meeting, for he was off with Lyanna, ensuring her comfort and safety. Instead, it was Tywin who introduced his daughter to the Wolf of the North. Ned bowed in formal courtesy. Cersei curtsied. Their eyes met. He was startled at how fiercely intelligent her gaze was. He had expected a porcelain doll, a meek figure of Lannister pride. Instead, he saw a self-assured woman with a calculating mind. She saw in him the quiet, cautious nature that the realm whispered about. She had heard that Eddard Stark was honorable, perhaps to a fault, and so different from Robert Baratheon's boisterous confidence. She wondered if that made him easily manipulated, or if his moral code would make him all the more stubborn. He was certainly not the dashing figure she had once dreamed of, but she had little choice. Her father had decided this was to be her fate, and there was no question that Tywin's will would be done. In those early days, Ned spent most of his hours supporting Robert's claim. There were rebellious lords to be approached, possible pockets of Targaryen loyalists to be subdued, and the city to restore to order. A mad king had died not long before, and the atrocities committed under his reign had left scars throughout the Seven Kingdoms. While Robert busied himself with the glory of kingship, drinking, feasting, cheering, and mourning in equal measure, Ned quietly took the burden of administration upon his shoulders. He coordinated with Jon Arryn, who had served as a father figure to both him and Robert in their younger days, and was informally recognized as the realm's leading statesman, though he had not yet been officially named Hand of the King. Together, Ned and Jon Arryn made sure that loyal men were stationed to patrol the streets, that rations were distributed to the starving populace, and that the crown's decrees were enforced with some measure of justice. It was not a glamorous task, but someone had to do it, and Ned was used to shouldering responsibilities for the sake of duty. He found that whenever he returned to the Red Keep, climbing the winding steps to the Solar where he was given quarters, Cersei Lannister's presence hovered like a specter. She would appear at dinner, politely offering conversation. She would inquire after the child he was said to have fathered, making her intentions unclear. Was this simple curiosity, or was she searching for weakness, for a handle to manipulate him? The bastard, Jon, was a small, quiet infant, and Ned had made arrangements with a wet nurse for his care, refusing to answer any pointed questions about his mother or how he came to be. Cersei's expression at these times was unreadable, a faint smile on her lips that never reached her eyes. As the days passed, the talk of the city was that Eddard Stark had a bastard to carry about like a whelp. Gossip was often cruel, calling the child a brand on the Starks' unwavering sense of honor. Yet Ned rarely bothered to refute the talk. Let them think what they would. His conscience was the only mirror he answered to. Amidst all these political upheavals, Robert's joy was nearly unbridled at having Lyanna by his side. He refused to let the trauma of war overshadow his delight in her survival. He spared no expense to see that she was attended by skilled healers, seamstresses, and ladies-in-waiting, all under the watchful protection of guards sworn to House Baratheon. Yet beneath the new king's jovial exterior, there lingered a deep anger at what had befallen Lyanna. She had been abducted, forced into a union with Rhaegar Targaryen, or so Robert believed. He still seethed at the memory of Rhaegar's last stand on the trident, but that rage was already shifting into something more complicated. Suspicion about the circumstances of her abduction, or perhaps the nature of the feelings Lyanna might have held. Lyanna, for her part, seemed withdrawn. She was clearly relieved to be free from the captivity that had stolen her from her family, but she had not thrown herself at Robert's feet in gratitude. Instead, she accepted his kindness with subdued caution. She had been close to death, and some part of that experience still haunted her. She clutched at Ned's hands whenever she saw him, though Robert's presence was rarely far behind. She tried to smile when Robert teased her or showed her something new and exciting in the capital, but her gaze sometimes drifted into sorrow. The entire realm awaited their marriage, for it would seal Robert's legitimacy as the hero king who had reclaimed his betrothed. But in the quiet corners of the Red Keep, Ned wondered if Lyanna was truly content with that fate. He couldn't be certain. He only knew that Robert's love for her was unwavering, and that Lyanna rarely spoke of what had happened to her in Dorne, or how she had been discovered in the tower where Rhaegar had left her to be guarded. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister set to work on the details of his daughter's betrothal. If Robert was determined to marry Lyanna so swiftly, then Tywin saw every advantage in pressing to have Cersei wed to Ned as soon as possible. He hoped that, in tying the Starks to the Lannisters, House Lannister would hold a pivotal position beside the new king. Who better to be the queen's brother-in-law than the father of the king's own prospective children, or so Tywin reasoned. That kind of familial entanglement could only strengthen the Lannisters' hand, especially considering that the realm would soon need funds, administration, and formidable alliances in the aftermath of a civil war. Tywin was a masterful political operator. He had studied the mood of the city and recognized that Robert, in all his impulsive glory, needed to avoid making an enemy of the Lannisters. He also recognized that Ned Stark, so dedicated to justice and duty, might prove a reliable ally if the Starks' honor was suitably bound to the Lannisters. But Ned remained uneasy. He spent long evenings pacing his chamber, sometimes standing at the balcony to look over King's Landing from the heights of the Red Keep. He would see the city's rooftops stretch out beneath him, the muddy waters of the Blackwater Rush reflecting torchlight from the city walls. Overhead, the sky was often thick with the promise of early autumn storms, though the days were still stiflingly hot. The city roiled with tension, uncertain whether to celebrate the new king or to fear the changes he would bring. Rumors circulated. The Targaryen children had been smuggled out of the city by loyalists, or perhaps they had been found and killed. Tywin Lannister's men had seized the capital swiftly, a move that was rumored to have ended in the brutal murder of Princess Elia Martell and her children, though no official statement had been made. Ned cringed at the memory of the atrocities he had heard. He wanted no part of such cruelty, yet he knew that the war had demanded ugly deeds from all sides. Sometimes, in those lonely hours, Ned allowed his mind to wander to the boy sleeping in the next chamber over, with the wet nurse who took care of him, Jon. He named the child himself, a name dear to him, recalling his foster father Jon Arryn, an act of silent homage to the man who had shaped Ned as a youth. The child's hair was dark as a raven's wing, his eyes gray. The resemblance to Ned was strong enough that few questioned the claim that Jon was Ned's bastard. But in Ned's heart, doubt and guilt gnawed relentlessly. The promise he had made weighed upon him, and it merged with the tidal wave of guilt for all that had been sacrificed in the war. Did he do right by his sister and by the realm in keeping this secret? In a land ravaged by rebellion, the truth of Jon's parentage could shatter the fragile peace Robert was trying to construct. So Ned sealed his lips. He told no one, not even Lyanna, who was still too fragile, still too haunted by the ghosts of her captivity. He hoped that, in the fullness of time, he might find a way to protect them all from the consequences of his decisions. The day came when Ned was summoned to the presence of King Robert, who was holding court informally in a smaller audience chamber off the Great Hall. Robert was dressed in fine clothes, though his thick arms and chest bulged beneath them, as if he had been meant to wear armor all his life. He looked younger than his 20-odd years when he laughed, but older when the burdens of his new position pressed on him. That day he was in a good mood. Lyanna was resting in her newly furnished apartments, and the marriage feast was being planned for the coming fortnight. Robert greeted Ned with an embrace that was genuine if somewhat perfunctory. Then he quickly launched into discussing the urgency of uniting the realm. Tywin Lannister stood near the dais, silent and imposing, clad in a cloak of crimson cloth of gold. His expression never wavered from that stoic Lannister mask. "We must not waste time, Ned," Robert said, a serious note creeping into his otherwise hearty tone. "The war might be over, but the real work begins now. The people are hungry for stability. They need to see that the houses who supported me are united, not just for the sake of formality, but for the good of the realm." Ned knew what was coming, but he bowed his head in polite acknowledgement. "As you say, Your Grace, the realm must be sewn back together, and I stand ready to serve in whichever capacity you decide." Tywin's voice interjected, smooth and authoritative. "Lord Stark, the union of House Stark and House Lannister will be a testament to this new era of cooperation. My daughter is prepared to fulfill her duty for the good of the realm. I trust you have no reservations that would hinder the final arrangements of the marriage contract." Ned took a quiet breath. He was no orator, and he despised the dance of politics, but he knew how to speak plainly. "I have no reservations," he said simply. "Only the intention to see that the alliance benefits all. May the 7 kingdoms prosper under his grace's rule." Robert clapped his hands, a satisfied grin on his face. "That's settled, then. Will marry you and Cersei the same fortnight as I wed Lyanna. One grand feast, one grand celebration. The city won't know what hit it. By the gods, we'll have the biggest wedding feast in living memory." In that chamber, the lines of the future were drawn. The wolf of the north would wed the lioness of the rock, and the stag would take the she-wolf for his queen. Outside, the city bustled, half in excitement, half in fear. The tension among the nobility was palpable. Everyone worried that some Targaryen loyalist might attempt a last desperate act of vengeance, or that the men of House Tyrell or House Martell might refuse to bend the knee. Yet the days slid by in a swirl of preparation. Dozens of ravens flew from the Red Keep, carrying invitations that were more like commands for the highest lords of the realm to attend the dual wedding. Word spread that the new king intended to lavish the realm with 8 days of feasting, turning sorrow into celebration at last. Cersei Lannister sat in her chambers overlooking Blackwater Bay, gazing out at the water with a peculiar expression that mingled regret and cold determination. She did not love Eddard Stark. How could she, having scarcely spoken to him in anything but official settings? But marriage was rarely about love, she had learned. She had once harbored fantasies of marrying Prince Rhaegar. She had thought her beauty and her father's power would make her the obvious choice for the Targaryen heir. But fate had twisted that dream into dust. Now, the new dream was the forging of an alliance that would keep the Lannisters at the pinnacle of influence. If that required her to wed the quiet, dutiful lord from the distant north, so be it. A man who had fathered a bastard already. How ironic, she thought, that I must be tied to him. But perhaps she could mold him, bend him to her will. Perhaps she could shape him into a figure that served her own interests. And if he refused, well, she would find ways to secure her place regardless. During these days, she received discreet visits from Jaime, her twin, who was already sworn into the Kingsguard at Tywin's urging. Jaime, freshly minted in white cloak and gilded armor, sought ways to be close to his sister, though the constraints of honor and the eyes of the court weighed heavily on them both. Cersei's jealousy, a slow-burning fury, raged inside her whenever she thought of Lyanna Stark. Could have been me, she reminded herself. Perhaps if she had been married to Robert, she would be the queen. But that path was closed, and now her father demanded she accept Ned. The more she thought of it, the more she wondered if perhaps she had lost nothing at all. Robert was as loud as a storm wind, as unsubtle as a charging boar. Eddard Stark might prove quieter, perhaps more pliable. She would have to see.